All right. So I'm Lucas Kelly, and I'm the one who made the paintings that look like this out there. A lot of them look pretty similar, wonky grids. And I'm going to talk, give you some background on my autobiography that leads to this, and it's going to start with these works that I did um, way back in the mid '90s. You might be thinking, why do we care about stuff in the mid '90s? Well, we don't anymore. I don't know where these are, but it does give some information on some background information of where the current work actually comes from. At the time I was making that work, I was reading a lot of magical realism, like Ilo Calvino, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Jorge Luis Borges. I was also touring with my friends' bands, living in a van, not down by the river, though that's very expensive these days. I was more so hanging out in like this punk subculture, hardcore, what would later be emo, but before it was co-opted and there was a hot topic. And so for me at the time, while my friends are screaming and playing driving guitars and laying on the ground, I'm trying to make work that's has a similar emotional resonance, but is doing so without a live performance. So I'm doing pieces where I'm documenting my breath with charcoal. I'm also starting to recognize artists that are working with a similar type of emotional content as far as I'm concerned. And at the time, Felix Gonzalez Torres is doing work that's really resonating with me. And also because he's using the aesthetic of minimalism, but imbuing it with emotional content, right? So prior to this time, minimalism for the most part, straight, white, male, like me, but not necessarily engaging with like the artist's hand at all, or any like personality or any identity. So at the time, I'm also making pieces where I'm like directly ripping off Felix Gonzalez Torres, trying to be poetic with these little moments while I'm on tour with my friends' bands, and trying to feel connected to what they're doing as far as content is concerned, but also feeling unbelievably alienated because their work primarily functions in this live performance with this giant group of people, and my work is essentially this isolated experience that's quiet, and I feel as if we're doing the same thing and they're looking at me like, thanks for carrying in the amp, right? So there's not really a lot of connection as I would have expected. The weird thing at the time too is I'm making, and you can't really see it here, it's pretty terrible image, but I'm making these really subtle paintings that have really rigid grids. And again, this is like in 1999. After this painting, I probably don't paint another grid for another 15 years, something like that. But for me, this is functioning completely differently. Like I have this, punk rock work, and then I have this formal, more perceptual work that's about subtle transitions in color, and I'm never really making the connection between the two. So that being said, now we're going to fast forward. We're going to go through an entire graduate school career. We're going to go through an entire career in New York City. We're going to skip over all the exhibitions and all that stuff and all the high rents that Bridget and I were just talking about. And we're going to, well, this is actually going back in time now that I think about it. But the reason I'm showing this picture of me in a sweet Ewok shirt and my dad is because in 2013, my dad passes away. And my dad and I were very close. And at the time, I was like just churning out a bunch of work. This hits me like a rock. And I just decide I'm going to stop making art. And I decide to stop making art for a year. I give myself an end date, and I say, I'm not going to make dead dad work. I'm going to allow myself to emotionally process. And then I'm going to come back to art if it feels right. And so I do. And that was 2013, 2014. I decided to get a studio. I start putting work together that will end up being this 2017 solo show called Last First Dance. which is named after this exact moment, which is my wedding, where instead of having my first dance with my wife decided that my parents should have their first dance because they never had an opportunity to have a first dance at their wedding because they never had a reception. And so we gave our first dance to my parents. Consequently, it's also the last dance my parents ever have together because my dad died shortly afterwards. So when I make this show, I'm thinking about these specific moments. How can I take from these specific moments and extract a color, a form, a sensibility about that moment that for me can be abstracted and placed into an object so that it can be a storage component or surrogate for that moment in time in my autobiography. But abstracted enough that these things can be aesthetic triggers to bring the viewer into a moment of a nostalgic response that they can relate to the work without having to know my narrative, right? And so here I'm using abstraction as a tool for me to have a very specific personal identification with a moment, but also hopefully allowing the viewer to have a different relationship. And so do I need you to know that the painting on the back wall there, titled West Coast, is about a trip to California with me and my dad? I don't. What I hope is that the color or the shape brings you to a place where you might be thinking the same way that I think a lot of people resonate with music, right? So with music, we hear a song and we're immediately brought back to a time where that song was the playlist to our existence, right? You're listening to the radio and all of a sudden you hear There Goes My Baby by the Drifters and you're like, whoa, I remember being in the kitchen with my mom, right? And like you're there and you can smell my mom making biscotti. Maybe you can't smell the biscotti, different cultures, that's cool. But you come to that moment, right? You get there from that sound. And my hope is that a color or shape can have that experience in the same way that music does sonically. Right. These pieces, for example, were a collaboration with my nieces and nephews where I asked them to identify a memory of my dad and describe it and talk about a color that they relate to. And so from their written descriptions, I made these objects and tried to match the color. Right? And so I used someone else's experience to try and facilitate an abstracted object. Skip a few years and a few solo shows and some other shows, and I'm making a ton of work. And I start doing this project called You, Me, These Walls, and Our Ghosts, which was an exhibition here in Philadelphia, right across the hall from Liquid. And at this point, I'm starting to think about memory and starting to think that it has to be drawn away from my own individual experience. I start thinking about the political nature of memory in and of itself. I start making a variety of pieces that start to bring back the grid and bring back the grid to a degree where it's becoming something in paintings and in sculptures. And so it becomes familiar to me because it's a system that I can easily follow and that most people can relate to. But it's also something that within its imperfection, because my grids are very wonky, there's a connection to the human condition, right? And so it doesn't feel sterile to me. So I'm at this party just before that show, and I say to a group of artists, does anybody know a neuroscientist? I'm really interested in figuring out if what I think about memory is actually accurate. So this whole time I'm doing talks, I'm like, and this is the way the brain works. Every time you think of a memory, there's a gap in your memory, and you fabricate something to fill that gap, and that's the freshest part of your memory. And so as you access your memory, you keep on wiping it away. It's this beautiful disaster of sentimentality, right? And so I was like, maybe I should talk to somebody who actually knows something about the brain. And so somebody knows a guy who knows a guy. Like these things happen in Philadelphia. And I end up in West Philly with this guy whose name is Anjan Chatterjee. And he runs the Penn Center for Neuroaesthetics. And he invites me to come to their lab. I am surprised to find out that labs don't actually all look like this. And when he's explaining their studies, I'm surprised to find out that they don't sound like this, right? So instead, what I find out is that he specifically studies neuroaesthetics and is one of the foremost voices on neuroaesthetics. And he's right here in Philadelphia, which is pretty cool. And so neuroaesthetics is a part of empirical aesthetics. It's a scientific approach to the study of aesthetic perceptions, art, film, music. And it uses neuroscience to understand aesthetic experience at a neural level. Specifically, it relates to aesthetic cognitivism. And what aesthetic cognitivism says is that engaging in art promotes understanding and knowledge, right? So it connects us. Dr. Chatterjee specifically looks at the aesthetic experience in three categories: knowledge and meaning, emotion and valuation, and sensory and motor skills. What I explained to him was I was interested in collaborating, but I in no way wanted to make drawings of brain scans. And he said that he was also not interested in such things. He wanted his lab to be influenced by an artist, and he wanted an artist to do something that was true nature of a collaboration. He wanted me to be more engaged in a study than making pictures of a study. And so one of the main questions that the PCFN asks is, what is art good for? And they've done studies which look at things like how Parkinson's patients relate to the paintings of Jackson Pollock versus the paintings of P.A. Mondrian, and whether or not there's a neural difference in their responses to these types of paintings. Or how do we engage with people? How is our bias, our implicit bias, enacted when we look at someone who we consider beautiful or we consider to have a facial anomaly? By the way, the study shows that we're kind of terrible about this, right? That we believe that, in general, people with facial anomalies are less trustworthy. So this is great. Like, I'm like learning all this stuff about the brain, but what about memory, right? This is the whole reason I was here. So one day we end up developing this study that says what differentiates emotions of an experience of aesthetic engagement versus a non-aesthetic engagement. And part of the study has this narrative instruction manipulation, which basically looks like that. It has you, the participant, write a little bit about an aesthetic experience. And so if you are attending the ballet, looking at a painting, be beholding architecture, things like that. And so what this means is we're asking the participant to engage in a memory experience and describe it. There, in these narratives, are embedded a number of emotional cues that give us an opportunity to take these experiences and block them out into larger categories. And so we have this emotions questionnaire that goes over 75 different emotions where we have the participant rate their emotional experience with this aesthetic moment. And then we ask them, like, okay, so you're talking about paintings. Like, are you a painter? Because that's going to change the way people perceive these situations. All right. So then, after all that stuff is done, I gather all this data and I think, okay, so where's the art in this? And I'm thinking about the academic nature of all of this. And I decide I'm going to make a color system based on these aesthetic responses. Now, most color systems that I'm familiar with as a college professor look a lot like this. They deal with value, tint, shade, saturation of color. They are broken up into very specific pigments where we're teaching students how to mix color for the function of it, right? What goes next to what mixes with what. And I'm thinking more about this question, right? This aesthetic emotions question. So how can I take these aesthetic emotions and make them the driving force for a color system? So what I did was take the list of 75 emotions, and if you look all the way on the left, it says Pantone color and RGB. And so I made a color system using essentially the Pantone color system as a model for matching. And in doing so, I thought about the interaction of color. This is a painting by Joseph Albers, who's famed for writing the book, The Interaction of Color. So I'm thinking about those physical components of Albers and Munsell, who's very interested in looking at color in a dimensional way, not just by value, but by saturation and by chroma, right? So it kind of has like an X, a Y, and a Z axis, right? And kind of looks at it like an object. But I'm thinking also, if this is about emotion, I want it to also engage on a more philosophical level. So I'm reading Goethe and his theory of colors, which looks at color on a phenomenological level. I'm also engaging in literature like Immanuel Kant's feelings of the observation on the feeling of the beautiful and the sublime. And I'm taking little pieces of literature and philosophy as well as these physical traits of color. And what I know about color psychology and how color interacts with our brain, usually in a marketing standpoint where somebody's trying to get you to buy something or make you hungry in a restaurant. That's why there's so much red in fast food restaurants. And so I start making my color system from these things. I think about political decisions like taking purple and making that the color of oppression, because that's a color that is specifically related to royalty. I think about that color system, that color wheel, and purple is on the opposite side of yellow. So I make beauty the opposite of oppression, and I make it yellow. It also relates to Immanuel Kant's writing, where he talks about beauty being fed by the sun, being these natural things that are fed by the sun. And I think this is a perfect complement, where I can take that interaction of color and also this philosophical way of looking at color and bring them together. We use this color system to create these system analyses that basically look at these nodes and plot them on where people's interactions are the most common. If you rate, for example, beauty very high, chances are you're rating awe very high. But chances are you're not rating amusement very high, right? So this is a way for us to get an opportunity to look at the different ways that these emotional experiences are connected. And so all this stuff looks really cool, and of course somebody's like, you should just make a sculpture of one of those. And I'm like, I don't really want to make a sculpture of one of those. But what I do start doing is thinking about how I can just take that color system and start to take the rationale out of it a little bit. Stop making it an illustration of other people's experiences and start painting the color of emotion within these moments. And so without putting titles of this is the color of this emotion, or you should be looking at this big color system so that you can understand the concepts behind these paintings, I go back to this idea of this nostalgic trigger and I start making these grid paintings in hopes that you might be triggered in a similar emotional way that I am by these paintings, or you might bring your own meaning to the painting and have a completely different visceral emotional response to a color when you see it, or to a set of colors when they react with each other. And of course, prior to this, I'm making a lot of work that is in a variety of different media. For this, because I'm working at UPenn, I'm thinking it's necessary to go back to a more academic approach. So that's one of the reasons why these are all oil painting on canvas. And the grid, again, helps me kind of make something that seems like it's following a system, even though it's not necessarily following a perfect system. That's pretty much it. Let me get to...
So my name is Bridget Purcell. I'm a visual artist, and I was trained as a painter at Tyler School of Art, and I have a master's degree in multidisciplinary visual studies from Washington University in St. Louis. So what we'll talk about is the fact that, I definitely came up as a painter. Like, my earlier projects were very much, informed by what I learned in my painting education. But I started to transition to more sculptural installation-based practice when I was in graduate school. So that really enabled me to mess with like the scale of my projects and the presentation method, obviously. But I think it's interesting that the whole time I was in graduate school, I was like, I'm a sculptor now, painting, we're not making paintings. But I think what you'll really see in the works I'm about to show you is that my painterly sensibility never really went away. I think a lot of my projects are still very much interested in color, interested in touch. This kind of like handmade element is very important to my work. So you'll see all of that in the slides that are to come. So these are paintings that I made pretty much like right after I graduated from undergrad. So I graduated from undergrad in 2008. So I was that unfortunate graduating class that it was like we graduated and then the stock market crashed pretty much like a couple of months after that. It was a really hard time to be a recent college graduate. And you'll see some of the works that I made in graduate school, I was directly talking about the recession and just like the impact that made on me psychologically in my life. But these paintings were made because my first recession job was at Whole Foods. I was a cashier at Whole Foods. I was bringing up very expensive vegetables that I couldn't afford. And it didn't work out. I was only there a few months, and I was just like, this is not like a space that is like going to work out for me in the long term. So as my kind of like goodbye to my Whole Foods job, I got a bunch of like vegetables and produce from Whole Foods, and I let them go bad on purpose. And then I did color studies of like the rotten food, basically. So these paintings are colors pulled from mold, really. And I think like what's interesting is at the time I would definitely have defined myself as an abstract painter. So there's always a personal story in all of my pieces, but I think a lot of that was buried under like layers of abstraction when I was earlier on in my artistic career. So that's something that I thought about a lot in graduate school as well. Like, how can I make some more direct references where these types of stories and these types of associations, like, the viewer doesn't have to go searching for it, right? Like, I feel like it was, again, kind of buried, and it would be hard maybe for someone just looking at this to like know anything about that. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, these pieces really were about like me kind of like butting up against capitalism, and capitalism as a system wasn't very kind to me in those early years right out of undergrad. But yeah, I kind of, again, still figured out a way to make like, aesthetically pleasing paintings out of these types of colors, but that's really like what they were pulling from. It was from decay and from like a corporation that I was working at the time. So these were paintings that were, I work a lot in series, which you'll see in later works that I show you. So these were coming out of like a similar methodology in terms of making. The mogul painting was, I was raised by downhill skiers. Both of my parents ski. So I learned how to ski when I was like 7, essentially. And the mogul painting I made when I was like in my early 20s, moguls are little bumps of snow that you have to navigate in between when you're a skier. And I felt like that was a really good kind of like metaphor for how I felt in my life at that time, just trying to figure things out and trying to figure out a way to navigate through my circumstances. And then the brain painting was, yeah, just really getting more into like the psychology of like where I was at when I was making these abstractions. And again, the psychological aspect I really pushed a lot more in graduate school, and I think it's more clear in some of my later works. But I started to think about like, again, the color is important, kind of like what's going on in my life is always important, but what is kind of like the cognitive experience that I'm having while I'm making the painting? And I think that the brain painting was like hinting at that. But you'll see that, again, I think more pronounced in some of the later works. So those were pieces that helped me get into graduate school. I moved to St. Louis for graduate school, and this was a piece that I made in my first year of graduate school. So at the time, I was trying to kind of like blow up my practice. I'd gotten really used to making abstract paintings, and I knew how to make that type of painting, like the series paintings that I showed you. But it started to just feel really automatic and like I'm just making something that I already know how to make. A lot of my early stuff in grad school was just like really unsuccessful. Not stuff that I would necessarily like show in a talk like this, but it was very transitional and me just like messing with my process and trying to see kind of like what comes out of that just departure. So this piece I made, which was about anxiety pretty much. It's called Candy Piece. Those are little handmade candies that I made out of ceramic and paper and paint. And it's kind of about this idea of comforting yourself with food or candy or sweets. It's the volume of candy that's in there is like too large to fit inside that bag. It's also kind of absurd because who would carry around that much candy with them anyway? And then you can also see there's little replicas of like a wallet and credit cards there. So again, it's really kind of like going more heavily into this psychological side of my work. But again, still making references to consumer culture because I feel like that really places these works in like a time and in our culture. It's very linked to American culture and it's very linked to like me coming up in those systems as a young adult. So this piece is called Sponge Cake. These are handmade replicas of sponges that I made out of foam. And I stacked them up and put them on a shelf with some gift bows. I really started to play with like just some like kind of like absurd pairings as I continued to make work in graduate school. Again, still using like a replica of a consumer object that is recognizable to the viewer, but putting it in a situation that, again, is kind of absurd. I mean, who would give someone sponges as a gift? They're painted green, which again, it kind of recalls this kind of like moldy, kind of like dirty kind of vibe, but I feel like my work often is still kind of like aesthetically pleasing because I was trained as a painter. So yeah, really kind of like walking this line between these different types of tensions. But starting to play with these different references to objects that we all recognize and seeing like what are other types of situations that we can put those in. This was a piece that I made at the tail end of my first year of graduate school. Those are handmade paper boxes that I folded and hand painted. This is kind of an absurd like factory kind of situation that I put myself in. This piece kind of killed me, honestly. Afterwards, I was like, I'm never making these particular objects ever again. But it became really important at this time that I was like hand making all of these replicas. Kind of like thinking about how we experience consumer objects. We see them on the shelf at Target. It's very kind of like separate from us. It's not something that like I really give a lot of thought about when I'm just like at the grocery store getting stuff after work or whatever. So really kind of like putting myself in the position where it's like I'm the machine making the thing is again just really getting at this kind of like psychological experience within these systems and what is it like to be a maker who's making this like the same object hundreds of times. So it was called Overflow. It was kind of about cultural excess. Cultural excess was something I thought a lot about during like the recession and in its aftermath. Just like thinking about this kind of like greed and overabundance, just like creating these unstable structures that like can have a devastating impact on other people. And, you know, these are modeled after kind of like disposable takeaway containers. So I think that there's kind of like a disposable kind of like trash thought process behind what these objects are too. This is Citron. This is another install that I made in graduate school. This is me really like, you'll see that the work that I made, one of the pieces I made for this show is a site-specific installation, but it kind of looks like a room fragment. And this is one of the earliest examples of me like messing with that as a presentation method. So those are more handmade replicas of sponges that I made out of foam. Really like paired it with these like bright acidic pop colors. I love colors that are kind of like attractive and they draw someone in, but they're also kind of ugly when you put them together. I also use a lot of paint colors that you can just buy at like Lowe's or Home Depot. So it's in conversation with colors that are like trending in like home decor, which, you know, to like Lucas's talking about how like color is used as marketing and how this is like a highly researched, like this is a whole industry. Like none of those colors end up in Home Depot by accident, right? Like this is like a whole thing that is like developed by designers. So I, again, like to kind of like riff off of that because I'm still using those colors as a material, but I'm using them in a way that you would never use in your house. And like they're kind of ugly, but still kind of pretty and kind of like messing with the different associations. This was called Color of the Year. So it's a reference to the Pantone Color of the Year. Every year Pantone chooses a color that is like the color, again, getting at those color trends and how that's like a whole industry and how we like really base a lot of like design decisions around those. I think another point with these room fragment installations is like it's kind of an in-between space between a domestic space and an institutional space. Like you kind of can't tell if you're looking at a room that's supposed to be inside someone's house, or is it like a weird room in like an office building or like a dorm room. Like it's kind of like you can't really place it, even though it's filled with a lot of these like, again, familiar objects. Again, playing with the absurdity, there's one sculpture of a sponge that was cast out of plaster, but like there's like this huge paint spill like set up that is coming from the one sponge. Of course that's staged, but like, again, absurd, like that amount of material coming from one sponge probably couldn't actually happen. And I think like as a female artist specifically, like I really had to talk a lot about like referencing domestic space while I was in graduate school and what that means to do that as a female artist. There's like a whole long history of female artists that did that in the 70s, but what I was really trying to talk about in graduate school was like what does it look like? Like, what does it mean when my generation does that, though? Like, how is it different when we're talking about domestic space in, like, 2012, for example? And I think that, like, from where we're sitting now after COVID, where a lot of people's relationships to domestic space changed during the pandemic, I think it's even more complicated now than it was 10 years ago. So that's something that I'm interested in, but I think sometimes female artists talking about domestic space can really get kind of pigeonholed into a very specific way of talking about that. But I'm really interested in like how that's like, I think, becoming like a more expansive conversation. So this was my thesis piece. This was end of graduate school, graduating. This piece was called Everything in Excess. Everything in this installation was handmade. I handmade those dustpans. I handmade all of like the colorful debris that is set up on the platform. The colors for the debris were pulled from, I just went to like, you know, like a dollar store or like a cheap grocery store in St. Louis and got like ugly party decorations, and that's where all of the colors came from. But again, it's just talking about like cultural excess and just like consumption and how we just kind of like pump out all of these objects as a culture and don't really think very much about like where they really come from or like what happens to them after we're finished with them. Around this time, I talked about the recession like the whole time I was in grad school, and my professors really started pushing back about like not being convinced that that was really what my work was about. And it was a comment that I didn't know like what to do with at the time, but I think in the works that I made after graduate school, that it became more clear like what the driving force really was that whole time. But this was kind of like me starting to question like how much of like a capitalism influence did I really want to talk about in my work, or was that really at the end of the day like the driving force and what I wanted it to be about? This was one of the last pieces that I made when I was in St. Louis. This is just like a simple color study on gendered personal care products. So looking at objects like, you know, like shaving cream or cleansers that are marketed towards females versus males, and seeing how those are just given like completely different color palettes. So it's like a poured painting. I used a lot of this like pour, like messy kind of like material moment as a motif in graduate school. Again, I was tasked a lot with like talking about what I was really trying to accomplish with that, but I really saw it as like it's an excessive material. It's kind of like uncontrolled. And I was just really interested in like pairing that with like hard edges. A lot of my work is really tight. It's really kind of hard edge. So kind of like introducing this like more chaotic element, just like introduce like this different tension, I felt like. So this was the first piece that I made after graduate school. I moved back to the Philadelphia area. I was 27, which is why this is called Series 27. And I really felt like, you know, my life had changed a lot, like as a result of moving back here. And at the same time, I felt like I moved to Fishtown. And at that time, like that neighborhood was under constant construction. Like all of the buildings were being torn down to be like rebuilt into these like newer condos and things. So I really kind of felt like I was feeling kind of like unmoored, and like my life had kind of like was just in like this very kind of like not nailed down kind of place. And then I felt like where I was living at the same time was like a similar kind of vibe. So I made 9 of these drawings. 9 is a multiple of 27. And just thinking about kind of like collapsing structures, and again, still using my pop colors because I love those, but yeah, just really kind of feeling like a little bit unmoored. This is a series that is in the show again and again, which is here at Park Towne. So this is where I'm really, again, kind of getting more into like the psychological side of my work. I think like what I really kind of took away from some of the comments that I got at the tail end of me being in graduate school was like, it's more about like the psychological experience of like being stressed out or being anxious, or like if these power structures are like messing with your life, like how do you feel in that moment? So I have some kind of like obsessive thinking kinds of tendencies, and that's really what these pieces are about. The one is just the word perfect repeated over and over and over again, kind of this like obsessive, repetitive thought loop, hyper-focusing on perfection, which I really feel like as a woman, like I feel like our culture places a lot of pressure on perfection. But again, I'm interested in like really kind of like questioning that pressure. And then the keeping time is like numbers in terms of like counting rituals. So like if you have obsessive thought loops like I do, sometimes when you like leave your house or leave a store, it's like you're counting the credit cards in your wallet over and over again to make sure you have all of them. And just really kind of thinking about, you know, the power structures that exist in our culture and how I think that they can provide a lot of stress, and then like how that kind of can manifest in like these other behaviors and impact you psychologically. This piece featured those panels in like a different installation. It's called Rituals for Leaving the House. I made those oven dial sculptures, which again is kind of like an obsessive, repetitive thought loop, like counting your oven dials, making sure they're off. I really was interested in that like obsessive thought loop as an experience that I think like more people than me have that, but how do you make like a visual artwork about that experience? And it's really interesting to make this kind of work because the people who come up to you at the opening are like, this is me. I am this person. And I think that that's one of the cool things about being in this show too. It's like all the artists are like, we're all repetitive in our thinking and in our making. Sometimes we don't even know why. And I think it's just like, it has to do with like how your brain is structured, I think. And I think it's really interesting to use art as a way to like connect to other people on that. This was a piece that I made for Park Towne in 2018. 2018 was like a big Me Too year. That was the year that, you know, like reports came out about the US gymnastics team being problematic towards women. And I just started thinking about, like, again, like, what does it mean for someone my age to make a work of feminist art? And, like, what is that conversation and how is it different than, you know, feminist art that was made in the 70s? So I like to use a lot of these types of colors that, again, are traditionally assigned to females, like purples, pinks, bright, kind of like poppy, pretty colors. But I put them on a volleyball set to kind of talk about like how are women protected in sports worlds, like how are they perceived, what does it like mean to be like in a female body while navigating those spaces. But I also was interested in like this piece not just being about this like heavy, scary content, but also like activating the space and being community oriented. Like it was meant to be interactive, and people who lived here like played with the piece. Like they had like impromptu pop-up games and things like that. So I was interested in like, yeah, kind of creating an alternative space within sports, which I think can be like very much like in its own territory in our culture. This was an install that I made in 2019. It was me tracking my emotions and like thoughts throughout the day for an entire month, and each like little panel was me tracking my emotions throughout the day. There's like the index card as like a tracking tool is something that shows up in my work a lot. It's a way for me again to like come up with like a physical manifestation of like what these psychological experiences are, and how to kind of like share that out to other people. I think, like I said, even when I was making those super abstract paintings, I think I always wanted to like have this conversation with people, but I think like with some of these later works, I've been trying to make much more like overt references to like, I am talking about anxiety right now. And I think like, yeah, just kind of like really making a more like visible effort to facilitate that conversation and like connect with others on that. So these were collages that I made in 2020 under lockdown. This series is also in the show here at Park Towne. I was feeling just like really disconnected from my community, disconnected from the arts, because again, none of us could like leave our houses in 2020. So I was making these like really tight kind of like grid type paintings that I ripped apart. They were on rice paper, which is semi-transparent, and I pasted them back together on panels. So I was thinking about, our societal structures really crumbling in 2020 in a lot of ways, but, thinking about different ways that we could like take these broken pieces and like put them back together. I think that that's something too. It's like my work is very like obsessive. It kind of gives me an outlet for those types of thoughts, but I'm also really interested in like this being a meditative and like healing space for me too. And just thinking about like other types of possibilities, like for me as an artist, but then also within our surrounding culture. So if it's not this structure, like if that breaks down, then like what could we have instead? This was a piece that I made in 2021. I have stress dreams about my teeth falling out. It is a recurring thing. So those are sculptures that I made of my teeth. And I put them on a metal shelf like very intentionally. Kind of has kind of like an icky kind of like thinking about your teeth on metal is just like bad. But again, it's in this kind of like aestheticized like interior space. So it's, again, that push-pull and that tension between like, an object that has this kind of like psychological content, but it's like, who would display teeth in their house? Like most people wouldn't, right? So it's kind of like pushing that display space into like a different territory. This is a piece I made last year for a solo show that I had here in Philly. It's called Keys, Wallet, Phone. So again, thinking about like counting your credit cards, counting your oven dials, making sure everything's off that you want it to be before you leave the house. This is checking that you have your keys, your wallet, and your phone every time you go anywhere, like leave anywhere, leave your house, leave the bar, whatever. So those are wallets that I made. It's like painting on Tyvek paper that I folded and like sewed into handmade wallets with little hand-painted credit cards. And then it's hard, I didn't put the detail, but the shelves have little like ceramic replicas of keys. This piece I made last year as well, it's called Car Crash. So those ceramic objects are a piece of my muffler system in my car that I had like a bad weld job that like was basically like exhaust was like pouring into the inside of my car, and my dad caught this and was like, wait, this is like really bad for you. So we got it like the old piece cut out, we got a new one welded in, like the car is okay now. But then the mechanic asked me if I wanted the faulty car piece, and I just said sure. And I just had it like in my studio for a number of years, but then I decided to cast it. So it's kind of like, again, getting at this idea that like a car is just like this something you buy at a dealership. Like you don't think about it, like you just like take it for granted, I think. But it's getting at like, you know, that we're all participants in this consumer culture space. But like our existence within that structure can be really fragile. And lastly, we come to, this is the site-specific install I made for this show again and again. These are like, I call them crumble sculptures. So it's again, me like messing with this idea of like a perfect tight art object and letting my work be a little bit more spontaneous and a little bit less like, you know, me molding this material to be a certain thing. Still riffing off of that, you know, you don't know if it's a domestic space or an institutional space, it's kind of in between. But again, it's still thinking, I think, about tension, like, you know, you get this release when you crumble something, or, you know, it's like they make those like fidgety things that like you can like have like a stress ball in your hand and just like crumble it. And it's like this way that you can comfort yourself in a stressful moment. So again, I think it's like all of my other stuff, I think at the end of the day, like the conversation about psychology is like a really important driving theme, but also placing it within these consumer culture structures that we all have to navigate. So that's all I have for you.